Edenicity is all about big dreams for cities. But is now really the right time for that? For years, big political donors have funded only weak status quo platforms, tax breaks for the rich, and for everyone else, higher prices and fewer services. That's why Zohran Mamdani is such a breath of fresh air. With a detailed, visionary platform, he is now the leading candidate for mayor of New York City. I'm excited because if he wins, it could be a big win for permaculture urbanism. So in today's episode, I'll review some of the key planks of Mamdani's platform, examine his plan to pay for it, and yes, political sparks will fly, and circle back to how this fits with Edenicity. Welcome to Edenicity. Best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Now, just a quick disclaimer, I have not paid for or been paid by anybody affiliated with Mamdani's campaign or the Democratic Party. In fact, even the Democratic Party didn't really get behind this guy. He won the Democratic primary in a surprise upset. Okay, with that said, let's go have a look at his campaign page. New York City is home to Marvel Comics and formerly home to DC Comics, so I like the superhero coloring and motifs that they put in the campaign. I'm sure it's not the first campaign to do this, but it's a nice touch. A quick summary of his platform. We'll get back into this in detail in a moment. A few endorsements, of course, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and a bunch of others. So pretty clear and to the point. Let's get to his platform. Now, as you can see, it's a really extensive platform, lots of elements to it, and I'm not going to go into every single plank of this platform in detail. It's all well worth a read, and much of it is well aligned with Edenicity, but for today, let's just zoom in on a few parts. So under housing, he's got a number of strategies in mind. Chief among them is freezing the rents on the 2 million rent-controlled housing units in the city, and then building another 200,000 new units over the next 10 years. And these would be permanently affordable. This is really key in a city where there have been a few co-op to condo conversions. Union built, that's good to see. Rent stabilized homes, of course. 100% affordable developments get fast-tracked, and he plans to fully staff the city's housing agencies so that they can get the work done faster. Now, as we drill down into the details of the housing policy, you can see that his campaign's done a fair amount of homework. They'll be building in several different sectors: senior, extremely low and low-income affordability, recommitting to public housing, building up a public sector workforce. This is really key. The open market just doesn't do a great job providing affordable housing, and even with strong incentives, there can be a lot of friction if the city governments aren't set up to make timely payments and process permits in an expedited way. So in many cities, such as Singapore and Vienna, the city government took the lead and did the construction in-house, so to speak, for decades with great success. And I've documented all of that in my book, Housing in 4 Cities, available in the links below. He fast-tracks the planning review and funds it through municipal bonds, activating city-owned land and buildings. This is a really interesting maneuver, pooling rental assistance to fund at the building level rather than getting between landlords and tenants, as is the case with Section 8. I may have more to say about that in a future episode. Another interesting development is to reform the planning and zoning process to create a holistic vision for durability, equity, and growth, both increasing the zoned capacity, supporting climate sustainability and accessibility. That's really Edenic. I like to see that. And in particular, transit-oriented development, where he's encouraging growth around subway stations and other public transit hubs throughout the city. This is very important to creating a greener city because it strongly favors public transit, and that can be a factor of about 100 more resource efficient when you look at the materials involved in building those transportation systems. Eliminating parking minimums, yes! This is awesome. A transit-friendly city such as New York should not be forcing people to build parking spaces when you'll find no shortage of young people who will literally laugh at those who maintain a car in the city as a status symbol. This is also very important for affordability, since an individual parking space can cost anywhere from $20,000 to beyond $80,000 to construct, and that's for places like Indiana. In a place like New York City, those prices are bound to be many times higher. So eliminating parking minimums makes housing a lot more affordable. So these are all really great policies. What else do we have? Food category, city-owned grocery stores. This is actually a bigger problem than a lot of people realize. And I had promised in a prior episode to show you some really cool resources about food deserts in the United States, of which there are many in New York City. The resource I found was here on the USDA website, and when I went to the atlas the other day, here's what I found. All right, loading up. All right, this is not how it used to look. This is not how it used to look at all. Yeah, zooming in on New York City. Uh-oh, an error occurred loading this layer. What's going on? All right, let me back up. Well, heck, let's just go to the main page. Due to the radical what? When I first landed on this page, this is what I saw. And as you can see, this is a highly politicized message that the White House is forcing agencies to post on their websites, in clear violation of the Hatch Act of 1939 that was made specifically to avoid this sort of thing. So this is kind of a shock. Okay, so let's table the food desert situation. Suffice it to say, there are many places in the United States, especially in areas of entrenched poverty, where finding food is a problem, where you either need a car, which many people can't afford, or you need to walk a long distance to get to a grocery store. And there have also been complaints in the city about the low quality of the grocery stores. So what I find so exciting and brave about this is that Mamdani is proposing to fill a gap that the open market has failed for decades to address. If this is not a legitimate role of government, I don't know what is. With municipal stores that don't pay rent or property taxes, they can reduce overhead and pass on the savings to shoppers. Buy and sell at wholesale prices, centralize warehousing and distribution, partner with local neighborhoods on products and sourcing. And speaking as a former market gardener who had just 6 public-facing hours a week to sell my wares, I find it astounding that even New York City's subsidized private grocery store operators are not required to take SNAP and WIC benefits. I mean, as a market gardener, I processed SNAP and WIC payments. So way to fill that market gap, Mamdani. We need to see much more of this. Also under affordability are fast, fare-free buses. Now, this is something that urbanists talk about a lot. I haven't checked, but perhaps City Nerd has done a piece on whether bus fares and train fares should be free. That seems very much in his lane. So during Mamdani's primary campaign, he put together these infographics, which I think summarize it pretty well. By making New York City's buses free, they can save up to 36 million hours every year and generate $1.5 billion in benefits, which is 2 times the lost revenues from free fares. So the claim is that without fare collection and with all-door boarding, riders won't have to queue up and wait for everybody in front of them to rifle through their wallets or purses and scan their fare cards. A third-party analyst suggests that this would shave 12% off of the average bus trip time, adding up to 36 million hours for riders every year, and that this would be a boon to the 1 in 5 New Yorkers who have to choose between their bus fare and things like heat, food, or paying the rent. One of the things that surprised me was this claim that fast and free buses would improve safety and the environment. Turns out this is not theory at all. In 2024, Mamdani was involved in a pilot program that made 5 bus routes free. What they found was that assaults on bus operators dropped by 40%. There were fewer crashes. There were lower CO2 emissions, presumably because the buses spent less time idling at stops. All of this boils down to healthier air and less noise. Of course, this was very popular. 72% of the people polled said it was great. Now, Mamdani's plan is much more holistic than just getting rid of fares. The plan is to build priority lanes and expand bus queue jump signals that gives buses priority at intersections and dedicated loading zones to keep double parkers out of the way. But do you see what he's doing here? He's prioritizing the needs of the many over the needs of the few in the public sphere. Now, Mamdani's Green Schools plan also caught my eye because this looked like the place where he was really going to pull out all the stops and move the city strongly in an Edenic direction. The plan is to renovate 500 public schools with renewable energy infrastructure, including probably heat pumps, and transform 500 asphalt schoolyards into vibrant green spaces, and build resilience hubs in 50 schools that provide resources and safe spaces during emergencies. So let's dig into that because there's a lot more going on with this proposal. All right, there's the green schoolyards, making the schoolyards cooler when they need to be 3 seasons of the year, prioritizing out-of-date facilities to combat environmental racism, yay, building rooftop solar, excellent, and expanding car-free open spaces. This is something that's started to catch on in Paris, France, and presumably other cities around the world. And I'm all for it. Having walked to school or taken buses for all but one of my 12 grade school years, it's shocking to me how commonplace it's become for parents to drop off and pick up their children by private car. This is not only polluting, but actually very dangerous. So by making the areas immediately around schools car-free and green, they're promoting safety, possibly more public transit use in the higher grades, and moving the city in an overall car-free direction. What's not to love about that? And the thing that I like best about all of this is that this is not theory. They started, of course, with pie-in-the-sky exciting ideas, but then they did their homework and found cases where people had actually built things like what they want to do and looked at whether they succeeded. And they list a whole bunch of benefits to the 99 green schoolyards in Denver, Colorado, including improved test scores, increased retention in the school districts, lower air temperature by 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the hottest months of the year, tons of carbon sequestered, and greatly reduced air pollution. They give a cost and benefit analysis, and we'll get into costs in just a moment. Okay, so there's a lot going on with this agenda. And the videos are just charming. I won't play them here. You can find them at zohranfornyc.com. I've put a link in the description below. But the big question is, how are they going to pay for it? Okay, so the campaign has come up with another set of nice infographics that looks at all of their campaign promises and adds up the costs, which works out to actually more than $10 billion, but we'll get to what that number is all about, and how they will get that money from a modest tax on people earning more than $1 million and from running a tighter ship of state. So they go into the total city budget and how the additional revenue would be 9% of the total budget. And the biggest chunk of money that's available is to simply raise their corporate tax rate to match that of New Jersey. That is from 7.5% up to 11.5%. And doing that raises $5 billion a year. In addition, they would tax those who are making more than $1 million an additional 2%. So they would pay 5.9% rather than 3.9%, the way everybody else does. And this would raise $4 billion a year. They would streamline their procurement process, saving, they believe, $300 million a year, and really bolster their collections on what the city is owed and raise an additional $690 million. Okay, so let's look at the more detailed plan for how Mamdani will pay for this. I won't get into too much detail here. The housing would be paid out of bonds and other means that are already at the city's disposal, but they anticipate that there will be retribution from Trump to the tune of maybe $10 billion, if I'm understanding this correctly, because basically everything else generates economic activity and revenue and is probably revenue neutral and also is supported by existing instruments such as bonds. But if the Trump administration takes a dim view of this, they could be looking at a $10 billion shortfall in federal funding, which is patently ridiculous because New York City is a major donor city to the federal government. I compiled some sources that you can find in the description below that suggest that New York City pays roughly $46 billion in federal income taxes. This is individual households paying their federal income taxes, which amounts to nearly 5 times as much as it receives from the federal government. So New York City is, by a wide margin, a donor city. And what I really like about this plan is that it's so politically realistic. Mamdani is anticipating retribution and planning to thrive despite it. Now, this millionaire tax raises the question of inequality. And I thought I'd share with you these amazing stills from a 6-minute video by Urbanism that aired 12 years ago. The video summarizes data and surveys where Americans of all political stripes were interviewed and asked what they thought the ideal distribution of wealth would be in the country. And the amount of agreement was surprising. Whether they were Democrats or Republicans, generally people thought that the ideal distribution would be that the top 20% should make maybe 2, 3, 4 times as much as the bottom 20% of the population. But realistically, everybody figured that the situation was much more unequal than that. When asked what they thought the real distribution was, they thought, well, the top 20% probably have about half the wealth, and the bottom 20% maybe have 5% of the wealth. But in fact, it turned out the actual distribution is the top 10% have 75% of the wealth, and the top 1% have 40% of the wealth. And he came up with a few creative ways to show that. This diagram shows the ideal distribution of wealth according to most Americans of every political stripe, where only 0.5% of us are below the poverty line, and the wealthiest are making maybe 10 times as much as them. But here's the country we're actually living in. In this country, 15% live below the poverty line, and when you take the wealth of the poorest 1% in this previous chart and look for it on this chart, half the country is poorer than that. In other words, half the country is poorer than the poorest 1% in the ideal case. And again, this was not a partisan issue in 2013. Now, what's causing this? The Economic Policy Institute has this graph, which you may have seen before, that shows how productivity and hourly wages rose together in lockstep until about 1973, after which productivity doubled, but hourly wages stagnated. So all of those gains in productivity went straight into the pockets of corporate executives and the wealthiest 1 to 10%. And the mechanism for that was the tax policy. Back in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, they were singing the praises of what a great life we had back in the 1950s. This was actually a racist dog whistle. But economically, what was driving that was a very progressive tax structure where the highest tax bracket was above 90%, if you can believe it. And that came down under Reagan to just under 25%. Very, very close to the lowest tax bracket. And on the corporate side, individual and corporate income taxes were about the same just after World War II, and they've drifted apart with individuals bearing the brunt of the tax burden ever since. So this is how tax policy has driven inequality. And this is not without consequences. Rising inequality wastes talent and compounds misery for everybody. And it does this because opportunities are lost and the costs spiral out of control. Now, why does this happen? Because inequality forces more and more people into more and more desperate circumstances where they're not able to achieve at their highest creative potential. So we lose the benefit of their talent. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it basically states that most of us need our survival needs met before we can really start thinking about safety, health, and stability. We need those needs met before we can look into being socially accepted, pursuing achievement, feeling confident, and finally achieving our creative potential. The more people are shoved down into circumstances where they're worried day to day about their survival, the fewer people will have inventing things and learning new things, or even starting new businesses. I'm actually at a loss as to how the wealthy and how corporations manage to talk themselves into resisting investing heavily in the public domain. And if they think they're smart about how to do that, think again. As I mentioned before, the private sector has utterly failed to provide affordable public housing except in the presence of very strong public incentives and where permitting and payments are done in a timely, efficient manner. There's this whole club of billionaires who are building doomsday bunkers to protect themselves from the angry mobs and hedging their bets with immortality treatments of one sort or another, when in order to deliver those services, we need a world of scientists and engineers and medical professionals making way faster progress than they have to date. The only way to get to that world is to bring as many people as possible up to the highest levels of Maslow's hierarchy. We do that through things like free transportation, free healthcare, and free education. And those are much, much harder to do if we're not efficiently attending to the basic structures of our cities. And this brings me back to Edenicity. Edenicity is an upgrade path for cities to restore the lost half of life on Earth. I've gone into the details of why that's the case in many other episodes on this channel. And to my surprise, when I got into this years ago, it turns out that if you build cities in an ecologically sensible way, it's very easy to provide vastly greater convenience, safety, and health for all residents. Now, I've put the Edenicity land use concept in the description below as a free download, but its core features that overlap with Mamdani's plan for New York City are that it's car-free, which the Mamdani plan addresses through getting rid of parking mandates for new housing and having open streets around schools. It's transit-oriented, meaning that housing is built near transit hubs and that also in those transit hubs, we should locate many other products and services so that in many cases, people don't even have to use transit. They can get their errands done in a short walk close to where they live. And this is baked into Mamdani's plan. Edenicity has a focus on public transportation, which under Mamdani's plan is both free for buses and faster with dedicated lanes and improved signaling. Renewable energy on-site in the city is another core facet of Edenicity. Mamdani's plan starts to implement this in the schools. And finally, food, gardens, farm strips, and forest strips everywhere is key to Edenicity. And again, Mamdani gets the ball rolling in the schools. Now, just to give you a sense of what's possible in a city like New York, I used the population around a point tool that I showed you last time to look at the density of different parts of the city and try to get a sense of how well the Edenicity plan would work in terms of food and energy. As you can see here in parts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, we'd only be able to produce about 29% of the food and energy on site. But that 29% is calories in the case of food. And in terms of vitamins and micronutrients, that 29% could very well supply nearly all of our needs with fresh, local produce. So this would be well worth doing, even imperfectly, in the denser boroughs of New York City. What about the less dense boroughs? like Staten Island. Well, even leaving the many parks alone, the density is low enough that if it redeveloped along the lines of Edenicity, the food and energy production on site could be as high as 94%. Now, again, these are very round numbers. We won't know the exact amounts until we really get into growing. And in future episodes, I hope to uncover more ground truth as to what's really possible in these locations and elsewhere. So if you're interested in doing that, you just might want to check and see if the subscribe button is visible. If it is, that means you're not subscribed, and you'll need to click that to be sure that Edenicity turns up in your feed in the future. Okay, here are some of those publications I mentioned. Thanks as always to the wonderful patrons for making this channel possible. I really appreciate it. Take care, stay green. See you next time.